What if I told you that the biggest obstacle standing between you and everything you want isn't lack of talent, time, or opportunity, but a lie you've been telling yourself since childhood? A lie so deeply embedded in your subconscious that you don't even recognize it as a lie anymore. You think it's just who you are. You think it's reality. You think it's the truth about your limitations, your potential, and what people like you can or cannot achieve in this world. But it's not the truth. It's a limiting belief. And it's been running your life like a puppet master, pulling invisible strings, controlling every decision you make, every opportunity you avoid, every dream you abandon before you even try. And the most terrifying part? You're not even aware it's happening. You think you're making conscious choices based on rational assessment of your abilities and circumstances, but you're not. You're running a program that was installed in your mind years ago, possibly decades ago, by people who had their own limiting beliefs and passed them down to you like a hereditary disease. My name is James Harrison. I'm 42 years old, and I live in a modest terraced house in Chorlton, Manchester. For most of my adult life, I considered myself a practical person. Realistic, some would say. I had a decent job as a middle manager at a logistics company, a small circle of friends, and a life that was fine. Not extraordinary, not miserable, just fine. And I told myself that fine was enough. That wanting more was greedy. That people like me, people from working-class backgrounds in Northern England, should be grateful for what we have and not reach for things that aren't meant for us. That belief, that single toxic thought pattern, had been governing my entire existence for as long as I could remember, and I had no idea how much it was costing me until one rainy Tuesday morning in November when everything changed. I was sitting in my car outside the office, listening to the rhythmic drumming of rain on the windscreen, working up the courage to walk into another day of meetings that didn't matter and problems that would never be solved. My phone buzzed with a text from my younger sister, Emily, who lived down in Birmingham and had always been the ambitious one in the family. Just got promoted to creative director. Celebrating tonight. Wish you could be here. The message was punctuated with champagne emojis and exclamation marks that seemed to mock my own stagnation. Emily was 38, 4 years younger than me, and she'd just achieved something I'd secretly dreamed about for years, but never pursued. She'd started at the same advertising agency as a junior designer 7 years ago, and now she was leading the entire creative department. Meanwhile, I'd been in the same position at my company for nearly a decade, turning down opportunities for advancement because I told myself I wasn't leadership material, that I didn't have what it takes, that people would see through me if I tried to climb higher. I stared at that text message for what felt like hours, and something inside me cracked. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. It was quieter than that, more like the sound of ice beginning to fracture before it completely breaks apart. I realized in that moment that the voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't charismatic enough to be a leader, that voice wasn't even mine. It was my father's voice, and his father's before him. A generational echo of working-class pragmatism that had morphed into something far more insidious. A belief system that didn't just encourage caution, it actively prevented growth. That evening, instead of going straight home to my empty flat and my usual routine of microwave dinner and Netflix, I drove to the University of Manchester Library. I'm not sure what I was looking for exactly. Maybe proof that I was wrong about myself. Maybe evidence that change was possible for people like me. I found myself in the psychology section, pulling books off shelves almost at random, until one title stopped me cold. The Architecture of Belief: How Mental Constructs Shape Reality by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist based in Leeds, who specialized in cognitive behavioral therapy and belief system restructuring. I took the book to a quiet corner table and started reading, and I didn't stop until the library closed at 10 o'clock that night. What I discovered in those pages fundamentally altered my understanding of human potential and personal limitation. Dr. Mitchell argued, with extensive research and case studies to support her claims, that virtually all of our limitations are self-imposed. Not in some fluffy, motivational speaker kind of way, but in a concrete, neurologically demonstrable way. Our brains, she explained, are prediction machines. They use past experiences to forecast future outcomes and guide our behavior. But here's the problem. They're not objective in this process. They're heavily biased toward confirming what we already believe. If you believe you're not good at public speaking, your brain will selectively remember every time you stumbled over words and conveniently forget every time you communicated clearly. If you believe you're not creative, your brain will dismiss your ideas as derivative before you even fully develop them. If you believe that success isn't for people like you, your brain will find evidence everywhere to support that belief, while completely ignoring countless examples of people from similar backgrounds who achieved extraordinary things. This phenomenon, Dr. Mitchell explained, is called confirmation bias, and it's one of the primary mechanisms by which limiting beliefs perpetuate themselves. But the book went deeper than just identifying the problem. It laid out a comprehensive framework for understanding where limiting beliefs come from, how they operate in our daily lives, and most importantly, how to systematically dismantle them. As I read chapter after chapter, I kept experiencing these moments of recognition, these gut-punching instances where I saw myself so clearly in the case studies and examples that I had to stop and catch my breath. There was the story of a man named Robert from Newcastle who'd convinced himself he was just not a maths person, based on a humiliating experience with a teacher in Year 7, and spent the next 30 years avoiding anything that required numerical analysis, effectively limiting his career options and earning potential. There was the account of a woman called Margaret from Cornwall, who believed she was unlovable because her first serious boyfriend had cheated on her, and she spent 2 decades unconsciously sabotaging every relationship that showed promise because deep down she expected to be abandoned eventually. There was the case of a young entrepreneur from London who'd internalized his immigrant parents' fear of taking risks and starting his own business, even though he had innovative ideas and solid business plans, because he couldn't shake the belief that failure would devastate his family and prove that he'd wasted the opportunities they'd sacrificed so much to give him. Each story was different in its specifics, but they all followed the same basic pattern. A formative experience, often in childhood or adolescence, creates an emotional imprint. The mind, trying to make sense of that experience and protect us from similar pain in the future, forms a belief about ourselves or the world. That belief then operates unconsciously, filtering our perception of reality and guiding our behavior in ways that consistently confirm the original belief. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, a closed loop that's incredibly difficult to break out of because you can't see it from inside it. You think you're seeing reality clearly, but you're actually seeing reality through a distorted lens that was ground and polished by your past experiences and the conclusions you drew from them. I left the library that night with a borrowed copy of Dr. Mitchell's book and a strange mixture of emotions swirling in my chest. There was relief in finally having a framework to understand why I'd been stuck for so long. There was anger at all the opportunities I'd missed because I'd been operating under false beliefs about my capabilities. There was fear about what it would mean to actually challenge these beliefs and potentially fail in a very public way. But underneath all of that, there was something I hadn't felt in years, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with understanding limiting beliefs and the psychology of personal transformation. I read everything I could find on the subject, from academic papers on cognitive psychology to memoirs of people who'd overcome significant mental and emotional barriers. I started paying attention to the automatic thoughts that arose in my daily life, the little voice that commented on everything I did and often criticized me in ways I would never criticize another person. I began to notice patterns I'd been completely blind to before. Every time an opportunity arose at work, a small voice would immediately generate reasons why I wasn't qualified or why it would end badly. Every time I thought about pursuing a hobby or interest, that same voice would remind me of past failures or suggest that starting something new at my age was pointless. I noticed that this voice was particularly active in certain situations. Whenever I was around people I perceived as more successful or accomplished than myself, the voice would become almost deafening, pointing out all the ways I didn't measure up. Whenever I considered taking any kind of risk, even small ones like trying a new restaurant or taking a different route to work, the voice would catastrophize potential outcomes and push me back toward the familiar and safe. And whenever I experienced even minor success or received a compliment, the voice would immediately downplay it, attributing it to luck or timing rather than my own abilities or efforts. This pattern of thinking had been so constant and so pervasive that I'd stopped recognizing it as a pattern. It was just background noise, like the hum of traffic or the buzz of fluorescent lights. It was my normal. But once I started paying attention, once I started seeing these thoughts as thoughts rather than as truth, something began to shift. I realized that I had a choice, not about whether these thoughts would arise, that seemed to be automatic, but about whether I would believe them and act on them. That realization was simultaneously empowering and terrifying, because it meant I could no longer blame my circumstances or my limitations for my lack of progress. The obstacle was internal, which meant the solution had to be internal as well. Around this time, I made a decision that probably seemed crazy to anyone who knew about it. I decided to reach out to Dr. Sarah Mitchell directly. I found her website, which listed a small private practice in Leeds where she saw clients, and I sent her an email. I didn't really expect a response. I assumed someone with her credentials and published work would be far too busy to reply to a random middle-aged man from Manchester, having what might generously be called a midlife crisis. But I sent the email anyway because not sending it felt like another example of limiting myself based on assumptions about what was possible. To my surprise, she responded within 48 hours. Her email was warm and professional, and she invited me to schedule an initial consultation to discuss whether her approach might be helpful for what I was experiencing. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a comfortable office in Leeds, in a Victorian building that had been converted into professional spaces, looking across a low coffee table at the woman whose book had started me on this unexpected journey. Dr. Mitchell was in her mid-50s, with grey-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing glasses that gave her an air of academic credibility, but with kind eyes that suggested genuine empathy rather than clinical detachment. "Tell me what brought you here, James," she said, and I found myself pouring out the whole story. The text message from Emily, the realization in the car park, the growing awareness of all the ways I'd been holding myself back, the fear that I'd wasted years of my life operating under false beliefs about who I was and what I was capable of. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, nodding at key points, but mostly just giving me the space to articulate things I'd barely admitted to myself. When I finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that felt like both validation and challenge. "James, everything you've described suggests that you're ready to do the work, and I want to be clear about what that means. This isn't going to be a quick fix or a simple matter of positive thinking. Limiting beliefs are deeply rooted in your neural architecture. They've been reinforced thousands of times over many years. Changing them requires conscious, sustained effort and a willingness to experience discomfort as you challenge patterns that feel true, even when they're not. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about her questions seriously. Was I prepared to challenge everything I'd believed about myself? Was I willing to risk feeling foolish or failing publicly in order to potentially break through to something better? The old me, the me from just a few weeks ago, would have found reasons to decline, to say that maybe this was too much or not the right time. But something had shifted. I'd seen the invisible bars of my cage, and now I couldn't unsee them. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready to do the work." And that's where the real journey began. Dr. Mitchell started our work together with what she called a belief audit. Over the next several sessions, we systematically identified and catalogued the limiting beliefs that had been running my life. Some of them were obvious once I started looking for them. The belief that I wasn't smart enough to lead people. The belief that taking risks was irresponsible. The belief that wanting more than what I had was somehow greedy or ungrateful. But others were more subtle, buried so deep that I initially resisted even acknowledging them as beliefs rather than facts. There was the belief that I had to work twice as hard as everyone else to achieve the same results because I didn't have the natural advantages that others had. There was the belief that showing vulnerability or admitting I didn't know something would make people lose respect for me. There was the belief that my value as a person was directly tied to my productivity and usefulness to others. And perhaps most damaging of all, there was the belief that I'd already made my most important choices in life, and now I was simply living out the consequences of those choices, with limited ability to change course. Dr. Mitchell had me write these beliefs down in a journal. Not just the beliefs themselves, but also the evidence I thought supported them. This exercise was eye-opening, because when I actually wrote out the evidence, it became embarrassingly clear how flimsy most of it was. My belief that I wasn't smart enough to lead, for instance, was based primarily on two experiences. One was a teacher in secondary school who told me I was better suited for practical work than intellectual pursuits. The other was a moment in my early 20s when I'd suggested an idea in a meeting at my first job, and a colleague had dismissed it rather condescendingly. 2 data points, separated by several years, neither of them actually measuring leadership capability or intelligence, and yet I'd built an entire identity around them. The belief that taking risks was irresponsible came almost entirely from my father, who'd worked in the same factory for 37 years and viewed any deviation from stable employment as reckless foolishness. He'd grown up during a time of economic uncertainty, and his risk aversion had been a survival strategy that served him well in his context. But I'd inherited it as an absolute truth rather than as a contextual strategy, and I'd applied it to situations where it actively harmed my growth and development. My father's fear of unemployment during the recession of the early 80s had somehow become my fear of ever trying anything that didn't come with guaranteed security, even though I lived in a completely different economic reality with different opportunities and different types of risk. As we worked through this process, Dr. Mitchell introduced me to the concept of cognitive distortions, the systematic errors in thinking that maintain limiting beliefs. One of the most common, she explained, was overgeneralization, where you take a single negative experience and turn it into a universal pattern. Another was mental filtering, where you focus exclusively on negative details while ignoring positive ones. There was black and white thinking, where everything was either perfect or a complete failure with no middle ground. There was catastrophizing, where you immediately jump to the worst possible outcome of any situation. And there was mind reading, where you assumed you knew what others were thinking about you, usually something negative. I recognized myself in every single one of these distortions. I overgeneralized constantly, turning individual setbacks into proof that I was fundamentally incapable of certain things. I filtered my memories to focus on my failures and mistakes, while dismissing or minimizing my successes. I thought in absolutes, believing that if I couldn't do something perfectly, there was no point in doing it at all. I catastrophized every potential risk, imagining elaborate disaster scenarios that paralyzed me into inaction. And I constantly assumed that people were judging me harshly, even when there was absolutely no evidence to support that assumption. But the most powerful part of working with Dr. Mitchell wasn't just identifying these patterns, it was learning to challenge them systematically. She taught me a technique called cognitive restructuring, which involved taking each limiting belief and examining it from multiple angles. First, you identify the belief and the situation that triggers it. Then you examine the evidence for and against the belief, being careful to look for evidence you might be ignoring because of confirmation bias. Then you consider alternative explanations or perspectives. And finally, you develop a more balanced, realistic thought to replace the distorted one. Let me give you a concrete example of how this worked in practice. A few weeks into our sessions, an opportunity came up at work. The company was creating a new position, a senior manager role that would oversee multiple departments and report directly to the director. It was exactly the kind of promotion I'd been avoiding for years, the kind of opportunity that triggered all of my limiting beliefs about leadership and capability. My immediate reaction, the automatic thought that arose within seconds of hearing about the position, was a familiar refrain. I'm not qualified for that. I don't have what it takes to manage that level of responsibility. They'll see right through me if I apply. I should just stay where I'm comfortable. But instead of accepting that thought as truth and moving on, which is what I would have done just a few months earlier, I applied the cognitive restructuring process Dr. Mitchell had taught me. I wrote down the limiting belief at the top of a page. I'm not qualified to be a senior manager. Then I listed the evidence I thought supported this belief. And here's what I came up with. I'd never managed more than 5 people at once. I didn't have an MBA like some of the other candidates probably would. I sometimes felt uncomfortable making tough decisions that might upset people. I'd been in my current position for a long time, which might suggest I'd stagnated rather than developed. Then came the harder part, looking for evidence against the belief. This required me to actively fight against my natural tendency to dismiss or minimize anything that contradicted my negative self-assessment. But I pushed through the discomfort and made myself list it all out anyway. I'd been successfully managing my current team for 8 years, with consistently positive feedback and strong performance metrics. I'd implemented several process improvements that had been adopted company-wide. People regularly came to me for advice on complex problems, which suggested they valued my judgment and expertise. I'd taken multiple professional development courses over the years and had actually learned a great deal about leadership and management. And my longevity in the position could just as easily be interpreted as loyalty and stability rather than stagnation. Looking at both lists side by side, something became obvious that hadn't been obvious when the thoughts were just swirling around in my head. The evidence against my limiting belief was actually much stronger than the evidence for it. But my brain had been automatically dismissing or downplaying the positive evidence while amplifying the negative evidence, because that's what brains do when they're operating under the influence of a limiting belief. They protect the belief, even when the belief is harmful, because the belief has become part of our identity, and our brain interprets threats to the belief as threats to our survival. I then moved to the next step, considering alternative perspectives. What would I tell a friend who was in this situation? Would I tell them they weren't qualified? Or would I encourage them to go for it? The answer was obvious. I would tell them they'd be crazy not to apply, that they had exactly the kind of experience and skills the role required, that staying comfortable was actually riskier than taking the challenge, because comfortable positions don't last forever in a changing economy. Why did I hold myself to a completely different standard than I would hold anyone else? Finally, I developed a more balanced thought to replace the automatic limiting one. Instead of, "I'm not qualified for that," I wrote down, "I have relevant experience and skills, and while there are areas where I'd need to develop further, that's true of any significant career progression. The question isn't whether I'm perfectly qualified right now, it's whether I have the foundation to succeed and the willingness to learn what I don't currently know." This reframed thought didn't eliminate all my anxiety about applying for the position, but it did remove the automatic veto that would have prevented me from even considering it. I applied for the position, and I'm not going to tell you that I got it, because I didn't. The job went to an external candidate with more extensive experience managing large teams. But here's what was different this time compared to every other opportunity I'd let pass by over the years. I actually tried. I put together a strong application. I prepared thoroughly for the interview, and I presented myself as a serious candidate rather than as someone who didn't really belong in the room. And when I didn't get the job, instead of using it as confirmation that I'd been right all along about my limitations, I asked for feedback and used it to identify specific areas where I could develop further. The hiring manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd been with the company for 15 years, was generous with her time. She told me that I'd interviewed well, and that my technical knowledge and process management skills were strong. Where I'd fallen short was in articulating a strategic vision for the department and demonstrating experience with change management and organizational restructuring. These were legitimate gaps in my experience, but they were gaps that could be filled through training and intentional development. They weren't evidence of fundamental inadequacy. They were simply areas where I needed to grow, which is completely normal and expected for anyone moving to a higher level of responsibility. Armed with this specific feedback, I did something I'd never done before. I went to my current manager and told him directly that I wanted to develop toward a senior leadership role, and I asked him what opportunities existed for me to gain experience in the areas where I was lacking. I expected resistance or dismissiveness, but instead he seemed almost relieved. "James, I've been hoping you'd express interest in advancement for years," he told me. "You're one of the most capable people on the team, but you've seemed content where you are, so I didn't want to push you. If you're serious about developing your leadership skills, I can absolutely create opportunities for you." Within a month, he'd involved me in a cross-departmental project that required coordinating with teams I'd never worked with before. He started inviting me to strategic planning meetings, where I could see how decisions were made at higher levels of the organization. He assigned me a mentor from the senior leadership team who could guide my development. None of this would have happened if I'd listened to my limiting beliefs and not applied for that position in the first place. The direct outcome wasn't what I'd hoped for, but the indirect outcomes were potentially even more valuable. This experience taught me something crucial that Dr. Mitchell had been trying to get me to understand from the beginning. Limiting beliefs aren't overcome through a single dramatic breakthrough. They're overcome through accumulated evidence that contradicts them. Every time you take action despite the limiting belief, every time you challenge the automatic thoughts and choose a different response, you create a small crack in the belief's foundation. And over time, those cracks accumulate until the entire structure becomes unstable and eventually collapses, replaced by beliefs that are based on current evidence rather than past trauma or inherited fears. But understanding this intellectually and actually living it were two very different things. There were days, sometimes entire weeks, when I felt like I was sliding backward, when the old thought patterns reasserted themselves with a vengeance, and I found myself doubting whether I was making any real progress at all. There were moments when the fear was so intense that I wanted to retreat back into my comfortable cage and forget this whole uncomfortable process of growth and change. And there were times when I questioned whether Dr. Mitchell's approach was actually working, or whether I was just wasting time and money on therapy that would ultimately change nothing. During one particularly difficult session, about 4 months into our work together, I expressed these doubts to Dr. Mitchell. I'd had a rough week at work where several things had gone wrong, and my inner critic had used these setbacks as evidence that I'd been deluding myself about my capabilities, that I wasn't actually capable of growth or change, that I should just accept my limitations and stop trying to be something I wasn't. I'd come into the session feeling defeated and skeptical, ready to hear that maybe I was right, maybe some people just couldn't change their fundamental nature. Instead, Dr. Mitchell pulled out my journal from our first session and read back to me some of the beliefs I'd written down at the beginning of our work. Beliefs like, I freeze up when I have to speak in meetings, and I can't handle conflict without becoming defensive. Then she asked me to think about recent examples of my behavior in those specific situations. I had to admit that my behavior had changed significantly. Just the previous week, I'd presented a complex proposal in a department meeting, fielding questions and challenges without freezing or becoming flustered. 2 days ago, I'd had a difficult conversation with a team member about their performance, and I'd managed to stay calm and constructive even when they became defensive. James, Doctor, Mitchell said, leaning forward with an intensity I hadn't seen from her before. The reason you're feeling discouraged right now is precisely because you're making progress. Your brain is fighting back because you're threatening its established patterns. When you have a setback, your old beliefs try to reassert control by interpreting that setback as evidence that change is impossible. But that's not what the evidence actually shows. What the evidence shows is that you're capable of new behaviors in many situations, and that you're still learning and developing in others. Progress isn't linear. It's not a straight line from point A to point B. It's messy and inconsistent, and sometimes frustrating. But that doesn't mean it's not real. She pulled out another document, a tracking sheet we'd been maintaining throughout our sessions, where we recorded instances of me challenging limiting beliefs and the outcomes of those challenges. Looking at it all laid out in black and white, the progress was undeniable. I'd taken on projects I would have avoided before. I'd spoken up in situations where I would have stayed silent. I'd advocated for myself in ways that would have felt impossibly uncomfortable just months earlier. And while not every attempt had been successful, the overall trajectory was clearly upward. I was attempting more, achieving more, and expanding my sense of what was possible for me. That session was a turning point, because it helped me understand that the process of overcoming limiting beliefs isn't about reaching a destination where you suddenly believe you can do anything without doubt or fear. It's about developing a different relationship with doubt and fear, where they become signals to pay attention rather than absolute vetoes on action. It's about building a track record of evidence that challenges old beliefs faster than your brain can find ways to dismiss that evidence. And it's about being patient with yourself through the inevitable setbacks and regressions that are a normal part of any genuine change process. Around this same time, something unexpected happened that accelerated my progress in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I reconnected with an old friend from university, a man named Thomas Webb, who I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. Thomas had moved to London after graduation and built a successful career in marketing, and he was back in Manchester for a conference. We met for drinks at a pub in the Northern Quarter, and as we caught up on the years we'd missed, I found myself telling him about the work I'd been doing with Dr. Mitchell and the realizations I'd been having about limiting beliefs. I expected Thomas to react with skepticism or discomfort. In my experience, people generally didn't want to hear about therapy or personal development work. They found it either too earnest or too self-indulgent. But Thomas surprised me. His face lit up with recognition, and he said, "God, James, I wish I'd figured that out 10 years ago. I spent my entire 20s convinced I wasn't creative enough to work in a creative field because one professor at university told me my ideas were derivative. I almost didn't pursue marketing because of that single comment. And it wasn't until I was 30 and desperate for a career change that I finally decided to try anyway. Turns out I'm actually quite good at creative problem solving. That professor was just having a bad day and took it out on my work, but I'd built an entire identity around that one interaction. We talked for hours that night, sharing stories of the ways we'd limited ourselves based on beliefs that had no solid foundation. Thomas told me about opportunities he'd missed because he'd convinced himself he wasn't charming enough or connected enough to succeed in certain environments. I told him about my years of avoiding leadership roles because I decided I wasn't the type of person who could inspire or guide others. And as we talked, something became clear to both of us. We weren't unique or unusual in having these limiting beliefs. In fact, they were almost universal. Everyone we knew carried around invisible restrictions based on past experiences and faulty conclusions drawn from incomplete information. This conversation with Thomas gave me a new perspective on my journey with Dr. Mitchell. I'd been thinking about it as addressing my personal problems, fixing what was broken in me specifically. But what if limiting beliefs weren't a personal failing at all? What if they were simply a side effect of how human brains process experience and create meaning? What if everyone had them to some degree, and the only difference was whether you were aware of them and actively working to challenge them, or whether you were unconsciously letting them run your life? That shift in perspective made the work feel less heavy, less like a criticism of who I'd been and more like a natural evolution of who I was becoming. I started talking more openly about what I was learning, not in a preachy way but just in normal conversation with friends and colleagues, and I was shocked by how many people responded with their own stories of limitations they'd accepted without questioning, dreams they'd abandoned because they'd decided they weren't realistic, and versions of themselves they'd given up on becoming because they'd concluded it wasn't possible for people like them. My sister Emily, the one whose promotion had inadvertently sparked this entire journey, told me during a phone call that she'd spent years believing she wasn't artistic enough to work in creative fields. She'd initially studied business at university because she'd internalized her parents' belief that creative careers were unstable and impractical. It was only after working in corporate environments for several years and being profoundly miserable that she'd finally taken a risk and enrolled in a design course. The crazy thing, she told me, is that I was good at it right from the start. All that time I'd spent telling myself I wasn't creative, I'd actually just been listening to Mum and Dad's fears instead of exploring my own abilities. These conversations reinforced something Dr. Mitchell had been teaching me all along. Limiting beliefs are almost never based on accurate assessment of our capabilities. They're based on isolated experiences, other people's fears and projections, cultural messages about what's possible for people like us, and our brain's tendency to create simple stories to explain complex realities. And once we adopt these beliefs, we unconsciously filter all subsequent experiences through them, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the belief appears to be confirmed over and over again. But here's what I learned that changed everything. The same mechanism that creates and reinforces limiting beliefs can also be used to create and reinforce empowering beliefs. Once you understand the process, once you see how your brain constructs meaning and guides behavior based on beliefs, you can deliberately intervene in that process. You can question beliefs that aren't serving you. You can seek out evidence that contradicts limiting narratives. You can design experiments that test whether your assumptions about yourself are actually accurate. And most importantly, you can build a new track record through action that gradually replaces old beliefs with new ones based on current data rather than past trauma. This realization brought me to a crucial moment in my journey. About 6 months after that rainy Tuesday morning, when Emily's text message had cracked something open inside me. I was sitting in Dr. Mitchell's office for what would turn out to be one of our final regular sessions, and she asked me a question that forced me to confront how much had actually changed. "James," she said, "when you first came to see me, you described yourself as realistic and practical. Would you still use those words to describe yourself now?" I thought about it carefully. "No," I finally said. I think what I called realistic was actually just pessimistic. I was constantly expecting things not to work out, assuming I wasn't capable of more than what I'd already achieved, interpreting every setback as confirmation that I'd been right to limit my ambitions. That's not realism. That's a defensive strategy disguised as wisdom. I paused, searching for the right words. If I were to describe myself now, I think I'd say I'm becoming evidence-based. I'm learning to actually look at what's true rather than just believing what feels true because it's familiar. Dr. Mitchell smiled. "That's exactly right. And that's why I think you're ready to move to the next phase of this work." The next phase, as Dr. Mitchell called it, wasn't about having more therapy sessions. It was about living differently. She explained that there comes a point in this work where the therapy room becomes less important than the real world, where the insights have to be tested and refined through actual experience, rather than just discussion and analysis. We agreed to move to monthly check-ins rather than weekly sessions, with the understanding that I could reach out if I hit a particularly difficult obstacle. But the real work, the daily work of challenging limiting beliefs and building new patterns, that was now my responsibility to carry forward on my own. I won't pretend this transition was easy. There's something comforting about having a scheduled appointment where you can process your struggles and doubts with someone who understands the framework you're working within. Without that regular structure, I sometimes felt adrift, unsure whether I was making progress or just convincing myself I was changing when I was actually just thinking about changing. But Dr. Mitchell had given me tools, and now it was time to use them without the safety net of weekly guidance. The first real test came about 3 weeks after we'd moved to monthly sessions. My company had been struggling with a significant operational problem for months. We had a warehouse in Liverpool that was consistently underperforming. Shipments were delayed, inventory management was chaotic, and employee morale was terrible. The warehouse manager, a man who'd been with the company for over 20 years, had become defensive and resistant to any suggestions for improvement. Multiple attempts to address the issues through standard channels had failed, and the problem was beginning to affect our reputation with major clients. During a senior management meeting, our director, a perpetually stressed woman named Caroline, who ran the entire logistics division, dropped a bomb that sent my heart racing. "We need someone to go to Liverpool for 3 months and sort this mess out," she said, her voice carrying that edge of frustration that suggested she'd already exhausted her patience with the situation. "We need a complete operational overhaul, and we need someone who understands our systems but can also think outside established procedures. James, I'd like you to take this on." The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at me, and in that moment, I felt every limiting belief I'd been working to overcome come rushing back with a vengeance. The voice in my head, that familiar critic I'd been learning to recognize and challenge, immediately started its litany of objections. "You've never managed a warehouse. You've never handled a turnaround situation. You'll be working with someone who has 2 decades more experience than you, and clearly doesn't want help. You'll fail publicly. You'll prove everyone right who thought you weren't leadership material." This is exactly the kind of high-visibility project where your limitations will become obvious to everyone. But something had changed. Instead of accepting these thoughts as truth and finding a way to decline the assignment, I recognized them for what they were: automatic reactions from a brain trying to protect me from potential embarrassment or failure by keeping me in familiar territory. They were predictions, not facts. They were based on fear, not evidence. And while they couldn't be simply dismissed, they also didn't have to control my decision. I took a breath, buying myself a few seconds to think, what would the evidence-based version of myself do in this situation? I'd successfully managed complex projects before. I'd demonstrated an ability to analyze problems systematically and develop practical solutions. I'd built good relationships with people across the company who could provide support and expertise in areas where I had gaps. I didn't know everything I'd need to know for this assignment, but I'd never learned those things precisely because I'd been avoiding assignments like this. The only way to gain experience was to take on challenges that required me to develop new capabilities. "I'll need some parameters," I heard myself saying, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, despite the anxiety churning in my gut. "What authority will I have to make structural changes? Who will I report to during the assignment? And what resources are available for implementation once we identify solutions?" These questions weren't stalling tactics, though part of me wished they were. They were legitimate strategic questions, the kind that competent leaders asked before committing to significant projects. Caroline looked slightly surprised, but also pleased. I think she'd expected more resistance. "You'll have full operational authority for the warehouse," she said. "You'll report directly to me with weekly updates. And we've budgeted for both personnel changes and process improvements, within reason. This is a priority project, James. We're giving you the tools you need to succeed. The question is whether you're willing to take it on." There it was, a direct question that required a clear answer. I could feel myself standing at a crossroads. One path led back to familiar territory, to staying in my comfortable role, to protecting myself from potential failure. The other path led into uncertainty, into a situation where I might fail, but where I might also discover capabilities I'd never developed because I'd never tested them. 6 months ago, I would have found a way to decline. I would have suggested someone else who was better qualified. I would have protected the limiting belief by avoiding the evidence that might contradict it. Yes, I said, I'll take it on. And just like that, I'd committed to the most challenging professional assignment of my career. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. I spent hours reviewing operational data from the Liverpool warehouse, looking for patterns that might reveal the root causes of the dysfunction. I interviewed people who'd worked there, who currently work there, and who dealt with the fallout from its problems. I read case studies of warehouse turnarounds in other companies. I reached out to Thomas, my friend who'd moved to London and worked in marketing, to ask about change management strategies he'd used when restructuring teams that were resistant to new approaches. Thomas, it turned out, had dealt with similar situations multiple times in his career. The biggest mistake people make with turnarounds, he told me over the phone, is assuming the problem is purely technical. They focus on fixing processes and systems, while ignoring the human factors that created the dysfunction in the first place. You're going to walk into a culture that's probably built around defensive routines and blame deflection. Your job isn't just to fix the warehouse operations. It's to change the culture so that the improvements can actually stick. This insight proved to be crucial because when I arrived in Liverpool on a grey Monday morning in March, I discovered that Thomas had been absolutely right. The warehouse wasn't just underperforming because of poor systems, though the systems were certainly problematic. It was underperforming because the people working there had developed a collective belief system that was just as limiting as any individual limiting belief I'd been working to overcome in myself. They believed that management didn't understand their real challenges, that any changes would make things worse rather than better, that their opinions didn't matter, and that the best strategy was to keep your head down and avoid taking responsibility for anything that might go wrong. The warehouse manager, a thick-set scouser named Derek Morrison, who'd started working there when he was 18 years old, embodied this defensive culture perfectly. When I introduced myself and explained that I'd be working with him to improve operations, his response was polite, but cold. Right. Well, we've had plenty of people come through here promising to fix everything. Usually they just make more work for us and then disappear before they have to deal with the consequences. But you're welcome to have a look around. Just try not to get in the way of people doing their actual jobs. In the past, I would have interpreted this hostility as confirmation that I shouldn't be there, that I was out of my depth, that I didn't have the authority or credibility to lead this kind of change. But I'd learned to recognize defensive behavior for what it usually was. Not an accurate assessment of my capabilities, but a protective reaction from someone who felt threatened or who'd been let down before. Derek wasn't reacting to me personally. He was reacting to what I represented, to the threat of change, and the fear of being blamed for problems that weren't entirely his fault. So instead of becoming defensive myself, or trying to assert my authority, I took a different approach. I spent the entire first week simply observing. I didn't make any changes or announce any plans. I just watched how the warehouse operated, talked to the workers on the floor about their daily challenges, and asked questions about why things were done the way they were done. I showed up early every morning and stayed late every evening, demonstrating through action that I wasn't there to judge from a distance, but to actually understand their reality. Slowly, grudgingly, people started to open up. A forklift driver named Sean, who'd been there almost as long as Derek, told me about equipment that was constantly breaking down because maintenance budgets had been cut years ago and never restored. A young woman named Amy, who managed inventory systems, explained how the software they were using was outdated and incompatible with the company's newer systems, requiring her to manually reconcile data that should have been automated. A loading dock supervisor named Graham described how the scheduling system didn't account for actual delivery patterns, creating constant bottlenecks during peak times while leaving workers idle during slower periods. What became clear through these conversations was that the problems were systemic, not personal. Yes, Derek's management style was outdated and overly defensive, but he'd been operating within constraints that would have made any manager look ineffective. Yes, the workers had developed a culture of learned helplessness, but they'd done so in response to years of their legitimate concerns being ignored or dismissed. The warehouse wasn't underperforming because people were lazy or incompetent. It was underperforming because the systems, resources, and organizational support needed for success simply weren't there. Armed with this understanding, I put together a comprehensive proposal for Caroline. It included significant capital investment in equipment and technology, restructuring of the scheduling system, additional training for supervisors, and a complete overhaul of the communication channels between the warehouse and central management. But it also included something less tangible and potentially more important: a plan to systematically challenge and change the limiting beliefs that had taken root in the warehouse culture. I proposed monthly all-hands meetings where successes would be celebrated and challenges would be discussed openly without blame. I suggested implementing a system where frontline workers could propose improvements directly and receive timely responses about whether their ideas could be implemented and why or why not. I recommended bringing Derek into the central management conversations about warehouse operations so he felt like a valued partner rather than a supervised problem. And I volunteered to extend my 3-month assignment if necessary to ensure that these cultural changes had time to take root. Caroline approved the plan with surprising speed. I think she'd expected me to focus purely on technical solutions, and the fact that I'd identified the cultural and psychological dimensions of the problem demonstrated a level of strategic thinking she hadn't anticipated from me. "This is exactly the kind of systems-level analysis we needed," she told me during our weekly call. "You're not just fixing symptoms, you're addressing root causes. That's real leadership, James." Her words created a strange mixture of pride and discomfort. Pride because I was getting recognition for capabilities I'd always had but never fully developed. Discomfort because this recognition contradicted the limiting beliefs I'd carried for so long about not being leadership material. There was a part of me that wanted to dismiss her praise, to find ways to downplay what I was accomplishing. But I recognized that impulse for what it was: another attempt by my brain to protect the old belief system, to maintain consistency with my historical self-concept even when that self-concept was based on outdated and inaccurate information. Instead of dismissing the praise, I made myself accept it and use it as evidence. Evidence that challenged the old beliefs. Evidence that supported a new understanding of my capabilities. Evidence that I was, in fact, capable of strategic thinking, systems analysis, and leadership in complex situations. This didn't mean I was perfect, or that I didn't have areas for continued development. It just meant that my previous assessment of my limitations had been wrong, and I needed to update my self-concept based on current data rather than past assumptions. The implementation phase of the warehouse turnaround was when things got really difficult. Having a good plan is one thing. Actually executing it while dealing with resistance, setbacks, and the inevitable messiness of organizational change is something else entirely. There were days when nothing seemed to work, when equipment that was supposed to be fixed broke down again, when new procedures were ignored or implemented incorrectly, when the old defensive culture reasserted itself and people reverted to blaming each other rather than solving problems collaboratively. There was one particularly brutal week in my second month, when everything seemed to fall apart simultaneously. A major shipment was delayed because of a miscommunication between the new scheduling system and the transport coordinator. An expensive piece of equipment I'd requisitioned arrived damaged and had to be sent back, causing delays in the efficiency improvements we'd been counting on. Derek, who'd been slowly warming to the changes, had a blow-up with one of his supervisors over the new reporting procedures and threatened to quit rather than deal with what he called unnecessary bureaucracy. I remember sitting in the tiny office they'd given me at the warehouse, staring at my laptop screen at 2 a.m, feeling completely overwhelmed and questioning every decision I'd made. The limiting beliefs that I'd been systematically challenging for months came roaring back with a vengeance. "You were right all along. You're not cut out for this kind of responsibility. You're going to fail publicly and prove that you should have stayed in your comfortable middle management role. Everyone who doubted you was correct. You've wasted months of therapy and effort on a fantasy of being more than you actually are." The thoughts were so loud and so convincing that I actually drafted an email to Caroline explaining why I didn't think the turnaround was working and suggesting that maybe someone with more experience should take over. I typed the whole thing out, my fingers moving almost automatically, constructing logical-sounding arguments for why I wasn't the right person for this assignment. And then, with my cursor hovering over the send button, I stopped. I recognized what I was doing. I was letting a temporary setback trigger my old limiting beliefs, and those beliefs were pushing me to quit precisely when quitting would confirm that they'd been right all along. I closed the email without sending it. Instead, I opened my phone and called Thomas, even though it was 2 a.m. and I had no right to wake him up for what might sound like a self-indulgent crisis. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep. "James, what's wrong? Is everything all right?" "No," I said honestly. "Everything is falling apart, and I'm about to quit because I don't think I can handle this." and I need someone to talk me down from the ledge of giving up." There was a pause, and then I heard Thomas getting out of bed and moving to another room, presumably so he wouldn't wake his partner. "Right," he said, his voice clearer now. "Tell me what's actually happening. Not what you're afraid it means about you, but what's objectively happening." So I told him. The delayed shipment, the damaged equipment, Derek's threatened resignation, the feeling that all my careful plans were crumbling and I had no idea how to salvage the situation. When I finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that shifted my entire perspective. "James, everything you just described is completely normal for organizational change. Did you think you were going to waltz in there, implement some new procedures, and everything would magically work perfectly? That's not how change works. Change is messy. There are always setbacks. Equipment always arrives broken or delayed. People always resist new procedures until they get comfortable with them. The question isn't whether these problems are happening. The question is how you respond to them." He was right, of course. I'd been interpreting these normal implementation challenges as evidence of my personal failure, when they were actually just the inevitable friction of changing established systems and cultures. "So what do?" I asked. "You solve the problems one at a time," Thomas said simply. "You find a workaround for the delayed shipment. You follow up on the damaged equipment. You have a real conversation with Derek about his concerns, rather than taking his threat to quit personally. And you stop making this about whether you're good enough, and start making it about what needs to happen next. You're not trying to prove anything about yourself, James. You're trying to fix a warehouse. Those are two completely different projects, and you've been accidentally working on the wrong one." That conversation changed everything. Thomas was right that I'd been unconsciously making the warehouse turnaround about validating my worth and proving that I could succeed in a leadership role. And every setback had felt like a personal failure, rather than just a problem that needed solving. But leadership wasn't about being perfect or having everything work smoothly. It was about dealing effectively with the inevitable messiness and challenges that arise in any complex undertaking. It was about maintaining strategic focus, despite tactical setbacks. It was about seeing problems as problems rather than as evidence of your inadequacy. The next morning, I went to work with a completely different energy. Instead of feeling defensive and overwhelmed, I felt clear. I met with a transport coordinator, and we worked out a solution for the delayed shipment that actually improved our backup logistics procedures. I escalated the damaged equipment issue with detailed documentation that resulted in both a replacement and a credit from the supplier. And I sat down with Derek for a 2-hour conversation that turned out to be one of the most important interactions of the entire project. "Derek," I said, after we'd settled into his cluttered office with coffee from the vending machine that tasted like burnt rubber, but at least contained caffeine, "I know the new reporting procedures feel like unnecessary bureaucracy, but I need you to understand why they exist. The reason central management has been unable to get you the resources you need for years is because they didn't have clear data about what was actually happening here. They saw underperformance, but they didn't understand the root causes because the information flow was broken. The reporting procedures aren't about micromanaging you. They're about giving you a voice that actually reaches decision makers." Derek looked at me skeptically. His thick arms crossed over his chest. "I've heard that before. Management says they want our input, but then they ignore it or water it down or tell us we don't understand the bigger picture." "You're right," I said, which clearly wasn't the response he'd expected. "That has happened, but it's not going to happen this time because I'm not going anywhere until these changes are working. I've extended my assignment here indefinitely. My success is now directly tied to your success, Derek. If this warehouse fails, I fail. We're in this together whether you like it or not." Something shifted in his expression. The defensive hostility softened slightly. "Why would you extend your assignment?" he asked. "You've got a comfortable position back in Manchester. Why would you stay here in this mess?" "Because," I said honestly, "this is the first time in my career that I've taken on something really difficult instead of playing it safe. And I'm not going to walk away just because it's hard. I spent too many years limiting myself based on fears about what I couldn't do. I'm not doing that anymore." Derek uncrossed his arms. "Fair enough," he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, "You know what the real problem is here, James? It's not the systems or the equipment, though those are bloody terrible. It's that everyone here stopped believing anything could actually get better. We stopped trying because trying just led to disappointment. So we did the minimum to keep the place running, and told ourselves that was the best we could do." I felt a jolt of recognition. He'd just described, in his own words, exactly what limiting beliefs looked like in an organizational context. A collective learned helplessness where people stopped attempting to solve problems because they'd internalized a belief that the problems were unsolvable. What if you're wrong? I asked. What if things can actually get better, and the only reason they haven't is because everyone believed they couldn't? Derek sat with that question for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I suppose we'll find out, won't we? That conversation with Derek marked a turning point in the warehouse project. He didn't suddenly transform into an enthusiastic champion of change, but he stopped actively resisting and started cautiously cooperating. And once Derek was on board, even tentatively, the rest of the warehouse staff began to follow his lead. The cultural shift I'd been trying to engineer started to happen organically, person by person, as people began to see that maybe things really could improve, that maybe their efforts would actually matter this time. Over the following weeks, I watched something remarkable unfold. As the new equipment came online and the system started working more smoothly, people's attitudes began to shift. Small successes created momentum. A problem solved efficiently became evidence that problems could be solved. An improvement suggestion that was actually implemented became evidence that their input mattered. Positive reinforcement started replacing the defensive cynicism that had characterized the culture. But the most interesting transformation was in Derek himself. Once he stopped viewing me as a threat or as another clueless manager who didn't understand the real challenges, he started to reveal capabilities I hadn't seen before. He had decades of operational knowledge and problem-solving experience that had been suppressed by his defensive posture. When he finally felt safe enough to engage constructively, he came up with innovations and efficiencies that I never would have thought of because I didn't have his deep understanding of the warehouse's specific dynamics. About 10 weeks into my assignment, something happened that crystallized how much had changed. There was a crisis with a major client shipment. Through a series of communication errors that weren't anyone's fault, a rush order for one of our largest accounts was at risk of being significantly delayed. In the old culture, this would have triggered a spiral of blame and defensive behavior. People would have pointed fingers at each other while the problem got worse. But this time, something different happened. Derek called an emergency meeting of the key staff and laid out the situation clearly and without blame. Right. We've got a problem and we need to solve it quickly. I don't care how it happened. I only care about fixing it. What do we need to do to get this shipment out on time? For the next 2 hours, the team worked together with a level of collaboration and creativity I hadn't seen before. People volunteered to work overtime. Alternative solutions were proposed and evaluated rapidly. Resources were reallocated on the fly. And somehow, through sheer collective determination, they got the shipment out with hours to spare. After everyone had gone home that night, Derek came to my office. That, he said, pointing back toward the warehouse floor, that's what this place can be when people actually believe we can succeed. That's what I've been trying to get us to for 20 years but couldn't figure out how to make happen. He paused, looking uncomfortable, and then added, I was wrong about you, James. When you first showed up, I thought you were just another corporate tosser who'd make things worse and then leave. But you actually gave a damn. You stayed. You listened. And you helped us remember what we could be. I won't lie. I teared up a bit hearing that. Not because I needed Derek's validation, though it certainly felt good to receive it, but because his words represented evidence of real change. Not just in the warehouse's operations, but in its culture and in the beliefs that people held about what was possible. They'd done exactly what I'd been doing in my personal work with Dr. Mitchell. They'd challenged limiting beliefs by accumulating evidence that contradicted them. And that evidence had given them permission to operate at a level they'd been capable of all along, but hadn't believed was accessible to them. 3 months into what was supposed to be a 3-month assignment, the Liverpool warehouse had been completely transformed. Key performance metrics had improved dramatically. Shipment delays had dropped by 70%. Employee satisfaction surveys, which we'd started conducting monthly, showed a complete reversal of morale. Inventory accuracy had improved from barely acceptable to exceeding company standards. And most importantly, the culture had shifted from defensive and reactive to collaborative and proactive. Caroline visited the warehouse to see the results in person, and I could tell she was genuinely impressed. As we walked through the facility, which now ran with a smoothness and efficiency that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, she turned to me and said, James, I'm going to be straight with you. When I assigned you to this project, I wasn't entirely confident you could pull it off. You had the technical skills, but I wasn't sure you had the leadership presence for something this complex." I was wrong. You didn't just fix the warehouse. You understood the real problem and addressed it at a fundamental level. That's executive-level thinking. Then she made me an offer that a year ago I would have immediately declined as being beyond my capabilities. We've got warehouses in Southampton and Glasgow that are heading towards similar problems. Nothing as acute as Liverpool was, but the same cultural patterns are developing. I want you to develop a replicable model for cultural and operational transformation that we can apply across the division. You'd be creating a new role, essentially, reporting directly to me, leading organizational change initiatives company-wide. Are you interested? I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said. Absolutely yes. The promotion came with a new title, Director of Organizational Development, a significant salary increase, and an office back at headquarters in Manchester that had windows overlooking the city centre. It also came with something I hadn't fully anticipated, a completely different type of limiting belief to overcome. I'd spent months learning to challenge beliefs about my capabilities and proving to myself that I could handle complex leadership challenges. But succeeding in Liverpool had created a new problem. Now I had to deal with the persistent feeling that I'd somehow fooled everyone, that my success had been a fluke, and that eventually people would realize I wasn't actually qualified for the position I'd been given. This phenomenon, as I learned when I brought it up during one of my monthly check-ins with Dr. Mitchell, has a name: Imposter syndrome. The feeling that you're a fraud who's somehow managed to deceive people into thinking you're competent when you're actually just moments away from being exposed as the imposter you know yourself to be. It's incredibly common among high achievers, Doctor, Mitchell explained. And, ironically, it tends to affect people who are actually very competent. People who genuinely aren't qualified for their positions rarely experience imposter syndrome because they lack the self-awareness to recognize the gap between their capabilities and the role's requirements. That's not particularly comforting, I said, managing a weak laugh. You're telling me that feeling like a fraud is evidence that I'm not a fraud? I'm telling you, Dr. Mitchell said patiently, that imposter syndrome is another form of limiting belief. It's your brain trying to protect you from potential failure by convincing you that you don't belong in situations that feel risky or uncomfortable. The belief serves the same function as your old beliefs about not being leadership material. It's attempting to keep you safe by keeping you small. The difference is that now you've outgrown your previous container, so your brain has to create a new limiting narrative to pull you back. She was right, of course. I'd proven to myself that I could lead complex change initiatives, but I hadn't yet integrated that evidence into a stable new self-concept. Part of me still expected to wake up and discover that the Liverpool success had been an elaborate dream, that I was still the middle manager afraid of his own potential, that the promotion and the recognition were mistakes that would soon be corrected when people saw the real me. This psychological pattern was exhausting because it required me to maintain two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. I'd achieved something significant, but I didn't really deserve it. People respected my work, but they were wrong to respect it. I'd been promoted, but only because they didn't realize I was unqualified. The imposter syndrome became particularly acute when I started working on the Southampton project. Southampton was a coastal city with a major shipping port, and our warehouse there was showing early signs of the same cultural and operational problems that had crippled Liverpool. But Southampton was different in crucial ways. It was a larger facility with more complex operations and a more entrenched management structure. The warehouse manager there, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd transferred from our Hong Kong operations and had an MBA from a prestigious business school, was nothing like Derek. Where Derek had been defensively hostile but ultimately open to change once he trusted me, Patricia was smooth, professional, and subtly undermining. Our first meeting set the tone for what would become a much more challenging dynamic than I'd experienced in Liverpool. Patricia's office was immaculate, decorated with awards and certifications that telegraphed her qualifications and achievements. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "James, welcome to Southampton. I've heard about your success in Liverpool. Quite impressive for someone without formal training in organizational psychology or change management. You must have a natural talent for it." The compliment landed like a criticism, which I suspected was exactly her intention. She'd managed to simultaneously acknowledge my success and question my credentials, all while maintaining perfect professional courtesy. I felt the imposter syndrome surge, That familiar voice whispering that she was right, that I'd gotten lucky in Liverpool but wouldn't be able to replicate that success here, especially not with someone as qualified as Patricia watching my every move with professional skepticism. But I'd learned something important from my work with Dr. Mitchell. When you feel defensive, it usually means someone has touched on an insecurity you haven't fully resolved. Patricia's comment had landed because part of me agreed with the implication that I wasn't properly qualified for my role. The solution wasn't to defend myself against her skepticism. The solution was to resolve the underlying insecurity so that comments like hers couldn't trigger defensive reactions. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "You're right that I don't have formal academic training in organizational development. My approach is based on practical experience, research, and guidance from specialists in the field. I'm looking forward to learning from your MBA perspective and your international experience. I imagine you've seen change management approaches in Hong Kong that we haven't implemented here, and I'd value your insights on what might work in this context." I watched her recalibrate slightly. She'd expected defensiveness or insecurity, and instead I'd acknowledged her point while reframing the situation as collaborative rather than competitive. It was a small victory, but it set a different tone than the one she'd been trying to establish. We weren't going to be adversaries where she proved her superiority by undermining my credibility. We were going to be colleagues working toward a shared objective, or at least that's what I was determined to make it. The Southampton project forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about limiting beliefs and personal growth. Overcoming one set of limiting beliefs doesn't make you immune to developing new ones. Growth is not a linear progression from limited to unlimited, from fearful to fearless, from doubting to confident. It's a continuous process of expanding your comfort zone, encountering new challenges that trigger new insecurities, and developing new capabilities to address those challenges. You don't solve the problem of limiting beliefs once and for all. You develop better and better tools for recognizing them and working through them when they arise. Working with Patricia over the following weeks was like playing chess against an opponent who was always 3 moves ahead. She never openly opposed my initiatives, which would have given me something concrete to address. Instead, she expressed concerns that sounded reasonable, asked questions that seemed thoughtful but were actually designed to create doubt, and implemented my suggestions in ways that were technically compliant but practically ineffective. It was death by 1,000 professional courtesy cuts, and it was making me question everything I thought I'd learned in Liverpool. During one particularly frustrating week, I reached out to Thomas for advice. We'd been talking more regularly since my late-night crisis call, and he'd become something of a sounding board for the challenges I was navigating. "She's playing a political game," Thomas said when I described Patricia's behavior. "And you're trying to play a collaborative problem-solving game. You're not even in the same match. The question is whether you can bring her into your game, or whether you need to learn to play hers." "I don't want to play political games," I said, hearing the frustration in my own voice. "That's exactly the kind of corporate maneuvering I've always hated." "Then don't," Thomas said simply. "But understand that by refusing to acknowledge the political dimension, you're letting her control the field. Politics isn't inherently bad, James. It's just about influence and relationships and understanding what people's real motivations are. You were brilliant at that in Liverpool. You understood what Derek and his team really needed, and you addressed those needs in ways that weren't about manipulation, but about genuine problem-solving. Patricia has different needs than Derek did. Figure out what they are, and you'll know how to work with her." This perspective shift helped me see Patricia differently. She wasn't being difficult just to be difficult. She was protecting something, probably her reputation and her position. She'd built her career on formal credentials and established methodologies, and here I was, someone without those credentials, getting recognition for an approach that was more intuitive and relationship-based than formally systematic. My success implicitly threatened her worldview about what makes someone qualified for leadership roles. No wonder she was undermining me. From her perspective, I represented a dangerous precedent, where people could advance based on practical results rather than proper qualifications. Understanding this allowed me to approach Patricia from a completely different angle. Instead of trying to prove myself to her or work around her resistance, I started asking for her expertise in specific areas where her formal training genuinely provided value that I lacked. I asked her to review my change management plans from an academic perspective and suggest improvements based on established models. I invited her to co-present with me on the Southampton project to Caroline, giving her visibility and credit for the theoretical framework underlying our practical interventions. At first, Patricia was suspicious of this approach, clearly wondering what angle I was playing. But gradually, as she realized I was genuinely interested in learning from her expertise and giving her credit for her contributions, her resistance began to soften. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult conversation about employee engagement strategies. Patricia had been trained in a model that emphasized structured surveys and data-driven interventions, while my Liverpool experience had taught me the value of informal conversations and relationship building. "Your approach worked in Liverpool," Patricia said, her tone careful and measured, "but I'm not convinced it scales to larger, more complex operations. Southampton has 3 times as many employees and much more complicated logistics. We need systematic approaches, not just relationship-based intuition." Instead of defending my approach, I surprised both of us by saying, "You're probably right. What if we combined both approaches? Use your systematic framework to ensure we're capturing data consistently and identifying patterns across the whole facility, while I focus on the relationship building and cultural aspects that the data can't fully capture. We each play to our strengths instead of competing over whose methodology is better." Patricia looked at me for a long moment, and I could almost see her reconsidering her assessment of me. "That could work," she said slowly. "If you're willing to follow a more structured approach than you used in Liverpool." "I am," I said, "because you're right that we need to be able to replicate and scale these interventions. Liverpool taught me what's possible. You can help me understand how to make it systematic and sustainable." That conversation marked a turning point in our working relationship. Patricia didn't become a close friend or an enthusiastic champion of everything I did, but she stopped actively undermining my efforts and started contributing her expertise genuinely. And something unexpected happened as we worked together more collaboratively. I started to internalize a more nuanced understanding of my own capabilities and limitations. I was good at intuitive relationship-based problem-solving and cultural transformation. I was less good at systematic methodology and formal frameworks. These weren't moral failings or evidence of inadequacy. They were simply the current contours of my skill set, which could be expanded through learning and collaboration. This realization helped with the imposter syndrome significantly. I stopped trying to be the expert in everything and started being honest about what I knew and what I didn't know. Paradoxically, this made me more credible rather than less credible. People respected the humility and the willingness to learn. They trusted me more when I said, "That's not my area of expertise, but let me connect you with someone who knows more about it than I do," than when I tried to fake knowledge I didn't have. Around this time, about 5 months into my new role, something happened in my personal life that tested my evolving beliefs about myself in an entirely different way. I met someone. Her name was Rachel, and she was a senior lecturer in psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University. We met at a professional development conference where I'd been invited to present a case study on the Liverpool warehouse transformation. Rachel had been in the audience, and she approached me afterwards with questions about the psychological frameworks I'd used. We ended up getting coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into exchanging phone numbers and making plans to meet again. I hadn't dated seriously in years. My last significant relationship had ended badly about 5 years earlier, and I'd told myself I was too busy with work to prioritize romantic relationships. But the truth, as I eventually admitted to Dr. Mitchell, was that I'd been avoiding relationships because of limiting beliefs about my worthiness of love and my capacity for emotional intimacy. Rachel was different from anyone I'd dated before. She was intellectually confident in ways that I found both attractive and intimidating. She had a PhD in cognitive psychology and published research on belief formation and change. She was exactly the kind of person who, in my old limiting belief framework, would never be interested in someone like me. Someone who'd done significant academic work versus someone who'd barely made it through university with a middling degree. Someone who moved in intellectual circles versus someone who worked in logistics management. Someone who was emotionally articulate versus someone who'd spent most of his life suppressing his feelings. Our third date, I made the mistake of voicing some of these insecurities. We were walking along the canal in Castlefield after dinner, and Rachel had been telling me about a research project on cognitive restructuring in therapy contexts. "This is exactly what I've been working on with my therapist," I said, and then immediately felt stupid for mentioning therapy, as if it was something shameful or weak. I mean, not that I'm broken or anything, I've been working on some limiting beliefs that were holding me back professionally and personally. Rachel stopped walking and turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. James, she said gently, why do you do that? You share something genuine and vulnerable, and then you immediately undercut it with self-deprecation or apology. You've done it every time we've met. It's like you're constantly expecting me to judge you or find you inadequate. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and recognition. She was right. I'd been so focused on challenging limiting beliefs in professional contexts that I hadn't fully addressed how they showed up in personal relationships. I suppose, I said carefully, I'm still learning to believe that someone like you would be genuinely interested in someone like me. The old me, the one from a year ago, would have never even approached you at that conference because I would have assumed you were out of my league. Out of your league? Rachel repeated, and I couldn't tell if she was amused or annoyed. James, I've been on dates with men who had impressive credentials and academic positions who were emotionally unavailable, intellectually arrogant, and completely uninterested in genuine connection. You're someone who's done real work on yourself, who's developed genuine expertise in organizational transformation, and who's humble enough to acknowledge what you don't know while being confident about what you do know. That's incredibly attractive. The fact that you don't seem to realize how attractive it is makes it even more so. I had no idea what to say to that. Part of me wanted to argue with her assessment, to point out all the ways I didn't measure up to what she deserved. But I recognized that impulse for what it was. Another limiting belief trying to protect me from potential hurt by preemptively disqualifying myself from relationships that felt too good to be true. I'm working on it, I finally said, believing that I'm enough, that I don't have to be perfect or extraordinary to deserve good things. It's harder in personal relationships than in professional ones. Why? Rachel asked, genuinely curious. I thought about that question for a long moment as we resumed walking. Because, I said slowly, working it out as I spoke, in professional contexts, there are clear metrics for success. Did the project work? Did the numbers improve? Did people accomplish their objectives? But in relationships, it's more ambiguous. I can't point to performance data to prove I'm a good partner. I just have to believe I'm worthy of love and trust that someone else will see that too. And that requires a level of confidence that I'm still developing. Rachel was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stuck with me long after that evening ended. James, here's what I've learned from my research. Limiting beliefs are often most powerful in areas where we care the most. We protect ourselves from potential pain in relationships because love matters more than professional success. We tell ourselves we're not worthy of love because that belief, as painful as it is, protects us from the risk of being rejected or hurt. But that protection comes at an enormous cost. It keeps us from experiencing the very connections we most want and need. She was absolutely right, and I knew it. I'd been making progress on limiting beliefs in professional contexts because the stakes felt manageable. Professional failure was disappointing but survivable. But romantic failure, emotional rejection, the risk of being truly seen and found insufficient, that felt catastrophic in ways I'd been avoiding examining too closely. This realization opened up an entirely new dimension of work I needed to do with Dr. Mitchell. In my next session with her, I brought up the conversation with Rachel. I think I've been approaching this whole limiting belief project as primarily professional development, I said. But the deeper, more entrenched beliefs are about personal worth, not professional capability. And those are much scarier to challenge because they feel more fundamental to who I am. Dr. Mitchell nodded. This is very common, she said. People often start therapeutic work focused on surface issues like career advancement or productivity because those feel safer to examine. But as they make progress in those areas, the deeper beliefs about fundamental worthiness and lovability start to surface. The good news is that you now have evidence that belief change is possible. You've proven to yourself that you can overcome beliefs that felt like unchangeable truth. Now you're applying that same process to beliefs that are more emotionally charged. Over the following months, I found myself working on parallel tracks. Professionally, I was implementing change initiatives in Southampton and beginning preliminary work in Glasgow, developing my expertise in organizational transformation and growing more comfortable with my new role. Personally, I was navigating a developing relationship with Rachel, learning to accept affection and care without immediately questioning whether I deserved it, and gradually building evidence that I was capable of healthy emotional intimacy despite years of believing I wasn't. The Glasgow project introduced yet another variation of limiting beliefs, this time at a collective level that was even more entrenched than what I'd encountered in Liverpool or Southampton. The Glasgow warehouse had been struggling for over a decade, through multiple management changes and several failed turnaround attempts. The workforce there had developed what psychologists call learned helplessness, a state where people stop trying to improve their situation because they've learned through repeated experience that their efforts don't matter. It was Liverpool's defensive culture, multiplied by 10 years of additional disappointment and failure. Walking into the Glasgow facility for the first time felt like stepping back in time to what Liverpool must have been like at its worst. The warehouse was physically deteriorating, with equipment that was outdated or broken, and a general atmosphere of resignation and defeat. The workers moved through their tasks with mechanical efficiency but zero engagement or initiative. The management team was going through the motions, implementing procedures they didn't believe in because they'd learned that caring about outcomes just led to frustration when those outcomes inevitably fell short of expectations. The warehouse manager in Glasgow, a tired-looking man named Alistair MacLeod, who'd been there through 3 previous turnaround attempts, met me with barely concealed cynicism. "Right, you're the latest management consultant come to fix all our problems," he said during our first meeting. "I've seen your type before. You'll be here for a few months. You'll write some reports. You'll implement some changes that make things temporarily better, and then you'll leave, and we'll slide right back to where we were because nothing fundamentally changes. The company doesn't really care about this facility. They just want to be able to say they tried." This wasn't defensive hostility like Derek's had been. This was something deeper and more corrosive. This was profound disillusionment, born from repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. Alistair wasn't protecting his ego or his position. He'd simply given up believing that improvement was possible, and he'd trained his entire team to give up as well. They'd adopted limiting beliefs not just about themselves, but about the entire system they worked within. The company doesn't care. Change initiatives always fail. Effort is pointless. These beliefs had become self-fulfilling prophecies that perpetuated the very failures they predicted. I realized that Glasgow would require something different from what had worked in Liverpool or Southampton. In Liverpool, I'd needed to build trust and demonstrate genuine understanding of their challenges. In Southampton, I'd needed to collaborate with resistant but professionally sophisticated management. But in Glasgow, I needed to somehow help people who'd stopped hoping learn to hope again. I needed to challenge collective learned helplessness, which was a much more difficult proposition than challenging individual limiting beliefs. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas, who'd been following my work with interest, suggested I bring him up to Glasgow for a few days. "I've dealt with demoralized teams before," he said, "and sometimes what helps is bringing in an outsider who has no stake in the local history or politics and can tell a different kind of story. Let me talk to your people. Let me share what I've seen work in completely different contexts." Sometimes hearing that change is possible from someone who isn't management makes it feel more credible. I arranged for Thomas to come to Glasgow for what we framed as a professional development workshop on change management. But what Thomas actually did was tell stories. Stories about teams he'd worked with that had been stuck and then became unstuck. Stories about organizations that had been failing and then transformed. Stories about people who'd given up and then found reasons to try again. He didn't preach or lecture. He just shared experiences that demonstrated, through specific examples rather than abstract principles, that change was possible even in situations that seemed hopeless. The impact was remarkable. Thomas wasn't part of their system, so his stories didn't trigger the same defensive reactions that came up when management talked about change. He was a peer from a different industry who had no reason to lie to them about what was possible, and crucially, he acknowledged the validity of their cynicism, while suggesting that cynicism was a choice that served some purposes but prevented others. "You've been burned before," he told them during the workshop. "Multiple times. I get it. It makes complete sense that you'd be skeptical about this latest change initiative. But here's the question you need to ask yourselves. Is your cynicism protecting you from disappointment, or is it preventing you from participating in something that might actually work this time? Because the cost of being wrong is very different in each case." After Thomas's visit, something began to shift in Glasgow. Not dramatically or immediately, but gradually people started engaging differently. They still expressed skepticism, But it was more active skepticism that asked critical questions rather than passive skepticism that dismissed everything automatically. They started offering suggestions tentatively, as if testing whether their input would actually matter this time. And crucially, when small improvements started happening, they noticed them and acknowledged them rather than dismissing them as temporary or meaningless. Working simultaneously on Liverpool consolidation, Southampton implementation, Glasgow transformation, and my relationship with Rachel, all while dealing with recurring waves of imposter syndrome and evolving limiting beliefs, was the most challenging period of my life. There were days when I felt completely overwhelmed, when I questioned whether I'd taken on more than I could handle, when the old voice whispered that I'd gotten lucky once and was about to crash spectacularly when that luck ran out. But there were also days when I felt more alive and engaged than I'd ever felt before, when I saw the ripple effects of challenging limiting beliefs in multiple contexts simultaneously, when I recognized how much I'd grown in such a relatively short time. The synthesis of all these experiences came during a conversation with Rachel about 6 months into our relationship. We were at her flat, cooking dinner together, and she asked me about the Glasgow project. I was describing Alistair's learned helplessness and the challenge of helping an entire team rediscover hope when Rachel stopped chopping vegetables and looked at me thoughtfully. "You realize," she said, "that what you're doing professionally is exactly what you've done personally. You're helping organizations overcome limiting beliefs the same way you've overcome your own. You're proving that change is possible by accumulating evidence that contradicts limiting narratives. You're building new patterns through repeated experience. You're doing cognitive behavioral therapy at an organizational scale." I'd never thought about it that way, but she was absolutely right. The frameworks Dr. Mitchell had taught me for personal transformation translated almost perfectly to organizational transformation, because they were based on fundamental principles of how beliefs form, persist, and change. Whether those beliefs existed in an individual mind or in a collective culture, the mechanisms were similar, and understanding those mechanisms gave you leverage to change them. "That's actually brilliant," I said slowly, "and it suggests that if this approach works at both individual and organizational levels, it might work at even larger scales. What if you could help entire communities or even societies overcome limiting beliefs about what's possible? What if the same principles could be applied to social change or economic development in regions that have experienced generational poverty or systemic disadvantage?" Rachel smiled. "Now you're thinking like a researcher, which, by the way, you are. You might not have a PhD, but you're doing original applied research in organizational psychology. You're developing practical interventions based on theoretical frameworks, and you're documenting what works and what doesn't. That's research, James." The imposter syndrome flared for just a moment, that automatic voice suggesting that calling what I did research was overreaching, that real researchers had credentials I didn't have. But I caught the thought before it could take root, examined it, and let it go. Rachel was right. I was doing research. I was contributing to knowledge about how organizations change and how beliefs can be systematically challenged at scale. The fact that I was doing it from a practitioner position rather than an academic one didn't make it less valuable or less legitimate. It just made it different, with different strengths and different limitations. This realization, this final piece of evidence that I was actually qualified for the role I was in and the work I was doing, felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The imposter syndrome didn't disappear completely. I suspected it never would entirely. But it lost its power to paralyze me, or to make me question my fundamental right to occupy the spaces I was in and to contribute the expertise I'd developed. I'd spent months building a new self-concept based on accumulated evidence, and that self-concept was finally becoming stable enough to withstand the inevitable moments of doubt and uncertainty that would continue to arise. 3 months later, standing in front of the Glasgow warehouse team and watching them present their own improvement initiatives to company leadership, seeing the pride in Alistair's face as he described how his team had reduced errors by 40% through procedures they'd developed themselves, I felt something I'd never felt before. Not pride in my own accomplishments, though I felt that too, but something deeper, a sense of purpose that came from helping others break free from limitations they'd accepted as permanent. A satisfaction that went beyond professional success to touch something more meaningful about contributing to human potential and possibility. After the presentation, as Caroline congratulated me and started talking about expanding the program to our European operations, I thought about that rainy Tuesday morning, almost 18 months earlier, when Emily's text message had cracked something open inside me. I'd been sitting in my car, feeling trapped by invisible limitations, convinced that I wasn't capable of more than what I'd already achieved. And now here I was, having proven not just to myself, but to dozens of other people that those limitations were illusions, that change was possible, that beliefs could be challenged and replaced with beliefs that served us better. The old James, the one who'd been afraid of his own potential, would have never imagined being where I was now. But he also wouldn't have believed he was capable of the journey that had brought me here. That's the insidious power of limiting beliefs. They don't just restrict what you do, they restrict what you can imagine doing. They don't just limit your actions, they limit your conception of what actions are even possible for someone like you. Breaking free from limiting beliefs isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing practice, a continuous process of noticing when old patterns try to reassert themselves, challenging beliefs that aren't serving you, and accumulating evidence that supports a more expansive understanding of your capabilities and worth. Some days would still be hard. Some limiting beliefs would still occasionally surface with surprising intensity. But I now had the tools to work through them, the confidence that I could overcome them, and the evidence that doing so was worth whatever temporary discomfort it required. And most importantly, I'd discovered that helping others break free from their limiting beliefs was perhaps the most effective way to continue breaking free from my own. Every time I helped someone challenge a belief that had been restricting their potential, I reinforced my own understanding that such beliefs were changeable rather than fixed. Every time I watched someone expand their sense of what was possible, I expanded my own sense of possibility. We were all doing it together, collectively learning to live bigger lives than our limiting beliefs had told us were available to people like us. The email from Thomas arrived on a Wednesday morning in late September, almost exactly 18 months after that pivotal rainy Tuesday when everything had started to change. The subject line was characteristically direct. Mad idea. Probably won't work. Want to try anyway? I opened it with curiosity and found a proposal that was simultaneously exciting and terrifying in ways I was learning to recognize as signs of genuine growth opportunity. Thomas had been watching my work with the warehouse transformations and had seen something I'd been too close to fully appreciate. What I'd developed wasn't just a set of techniques for fixing underperforming facilities. It was a replicable methodology for organizational belief change that could be applied far beyond logistics companies. His proposal was simple but ambitious. We should start a consulting firm together, specializing in helping organizations overcome the limiting beliefs and learned helplessness that kept them stuck despite having access to resources and opportunities. He'd handle the business development, marketing, and client relationships. I'd handle the methodology, implementation, and case study documentation. We'd build something that could scale beyond what either of us could accomplish individually. My immediate reaction was a familiar cocktail of excitement and self-doubt. The excitement was obvious. This was a chance to take what I'd learned and apply it at a much larger scale, to build something entrepreneurial, to partner with someone I trusted and who brought complementary skills to the venture. But the self-doubt was equally powerful. Who was I to start a consulting firm? I didn't have an MBA or formal credentials in organizational psychology. I'd only been in my current role for a year. Wasn't this moving too fast? Reaching too far? Setting myself up for a very public failure that would prove all my old limiting beliefs had been correct all along? I recognized these thoughts immediately for what they were. The same limiting beliefs that had kept me stuck for decades, now dressed up in slightly more sophisticated clothing, but serving the same protective function. They were trying to keep me safe by keeping me from taking risks that felt uncomfortable. But I'd learned something crucial over the past 18 months. Discomfort wasn't a sign that something was wrong. It was usually a sign that something was right, that I was stretching beyond my previous limitations and growing into new capabilities. I called Thomas that evening. I'm interested, I told him, but I need to think through some practical considerations before committing. I have a responsibility to my current company to finish what I've started with the warehouse transformations. And I need to understand what starting a business would actually involve, because I've never done anything remotely entrepreneurial before. Of course, Thomas said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I wouldn't expect you to just jump in without thinking it through. That wouldn't be the James I know. But I want you to recognize something. The voice that's telling you that you're not qualified or experienced enough to do this, that's exactly the voice we help our clients learn to challenge. If we can't overcome our own limiting beliefs, how can we credibly help others overcome theirs? He was absolutely right, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, someone who'd built a professional reputation on helping organizations challenge self-limiting beliefs, and I was being stopped by my own limiting beliefs about entrepreneurship and my qualifications to build a consulting practice. If I couldn't apply my own methodology to this situation, then perhaps the methodology wasn't as robust as I'd thought, or perhaps I just needed to practice what I'd been preaching. I brought the proposal to my next session with Dr. Mitchell, now spaced out to once every 6 weeks, as I'd become more self-sufficient in managing my own belief patterns. "I think I know what you're going to say," I told her after explaining Thomas's offer, "that this is another opportunity to challenge limiting beliefs and build evidence of my capabilities, that the fear I'm feeling is normal and doesn't mean I shouldn't do it, that I should evaluate the decision based on evidence and strategic thinking rather than emotional reactions." Dr. Mitchell laughed. "You're right, that is what I'd say. But I'm also noticing something important. You already know how to work through this decision using the frameworks we've developed. You don't actually need me to guide you through it anymore. What you're looking for is permission or validation, and the truth is you don't need that either. You're capable of making this decision on your own by applying the tools you've already mastered." She was right, of course. I'd become so accustomed to processing major decisions with her guidance that I hadn't fully recognized I'd internalized the methodology enough to apply it independently. This realization was both empowering and slightly melancholy. It meant I was ready to graduate from regular therapy, which was a marker of real progress. But it also meant losing the safety net of scheduled sessions, where I could process my doubts and fears with someone who understood the frameworks I was operating within. "So this might be one of our last regular sessions," I said, feeling the weight of that transition. "Possibly," Dr. Mitchell agreed, "though I'm always here if you need a check-in or if you encounter challenges that would benefit from professional support. But James, you've done the work. You've fundamentally changed your relationship with limiting beliefs. You've built evidence of capabilities you didn't think you had. You've developed tools for challenging unhelpful thought patterns. You've applied these principles not just to your own life but to helping dozens of other people transform their limiting beliefs. You're ready to do this without weekly or monthly sessions. You're ready to trust yourself." That conversation marked another invisible threshold. I'd started therapy 18 months earlier, feeling broken and stuck, convinced that I needed fixing by someone with more expertise than I possessed. I was ending regular therapy having discovered that I'd never been broken at all. I'd just been operating under false beliefs about my limitations, and once those beliefs were challenged with evidence, my actual capabilities had been there all along, waiting to be accessed and developed. I took Thomas's proposal to Caroline and laid out my thinking honestly. I explained that I wanted to finish the Glasgow transformation and document the methodology thoroughly so the company could continue applying it after I left. I offered to stay for 6 months to ensure a clean transition and to train someone to take over the organizational development role I'd been filling. And I asked for her blessing to start a consulting firm that would, among other clients, potentially work with our company on future transformation projects. Caroline's response surprised me. "James, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed to lose you. You've created tremendous value here, and you're just hitting your stride in this role. But I'm not going to try to talk you out of this opportunity. You've outgrown what we can offer you here, and the entrepreneurial path aligns better with who you're becoming. I respect that. And yes, I'd absolutely be interested in contracting with your new firm for future work. You've proven you can deliver results, and I'd rather maintain a relationship with you as a consultant than lose access to your expertise entirely." Her support meant more than I'd expected. It validated that I wasn't being impulsive or foolish, that people I respected saw genuine potential in this venture. But more than that, it provided another piece of evidence that I could trust my own judgment about major life decisions. I'd evaluated the opportunity strategically, identified both the risks and the potential rewards, and made a choice that aligned with my values and long-term goals. That was exactly what emotionally mature adults did, and the fact that I'd done it without being paralyzed by self-doubt or limiting beliefs was itself evidence of how far I'd come. The conversation I'd been avoiding, however, was the one I needed to have with my father. I'd been back to visit my parents only a handful of times since starting my work with Dr. Mitchell, and I'd carefully avoided discussing the changes I'd been going through. My father was 73 now, retired from the factory where he'd worked for nearly 4 decades, spending his days in the terraced house in Salford where I'd grown up. He was from a generation and a culture that viewed therapy with suspicion, entrepreneurship with skepticism, and ambition with a mixture of pride and concern that it might lead to disappointment. But starting a business with Thomas meant I'd need to explain what I was doing and why, and I'd need to confront the generational limiting beliefs that had been passed down from my grandfather to my father to me. Beliefs about knowing your place, about not reaching above your station, about the dangers of wanting more than what people like us were meant to have. These weren't just my limiting beliefs. They were family beliefs, cultural beliefs, beliefs that had been adaptive in certain historical contexts, but had become maladaptive constraints in a world with different opportunities and different risks. I drove to Salford on a Sunday afternoon in October, the motorway cutting through countryside that was beginning to show autumn colours. My mother was visiting my sister Emily in Birmingham, which meant it would be just my father and me, which was probably better for the conversation I needed to have. We sat in his small living room, drinking tea from the same chipped mugs that had been in the house for as long as I could remember, and I told him about the consulting firm Thomas, and I wanted to start. My father listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I hadn't expected. "Your mother always said you were too cautious, like me. She said you were playing it safe when you could have done more. I told her you were being sensible, that there's nothing wrong with steady work and secure employment. But maybe she was right." I felt something shift in my chest. "Dad, I spent most of my adult life believing that wanting more was irresponsible, that taking risks was foolish, that people from our background should be grateful for what we have and not reach for things that aren't meant for us." Those beliefs kept me stuck in a job I'd outgrown, in a life that felt smaller than it needed to be. And I got those beliefs from you, though I know you were just trying to protect me from disappointment and failure. My father's jaw tightened slightly. "I worked in that factory for 37 years, James. Through recessions, through layoffs, through times when half the men on my shift lost their jobs. I kept my head down, did my work, and provided for my family. There's no shame in that. It's honest work." "I know, Dad," I said gently, "and I'm not criticizing your choices or your life. You did what made sense in your context, with the opportunities and constraints you faced. But your context and my context are different. The economy is different, the opportunities are different, and the risks are different. What was wise caution for you became limiting fear for me. And I don't want to pass those same fears on to my own children someday." He looked at me sharply. "Children? You and that Rachel, then?" I felt my face flush. "Possibly. Eventually. We're not there yet, but yes, I can see it heading in that direction. Which is another reason I need to break these patterns now. I don't want my children to grow up believing that their background determines their ceiling, that wanting more is greedy, that taking risks is irresponsible. I want them to believe that they can pursue whatever genuinely interests them and develop whatever capabilities they're willing to work for." My father was quiet again, staring into his tea mug. Then, without looking up, he said something that broke my heart and healed something simultaneously. "I never wanted you to feel limited, son. I wanted you to feel safe. I'd seen too many men reach for more and end up with nothing. I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was just passing on my own fears and calling it wisdom." I'd never heard my father talk like this, with this level of emotional honesty and self-reflection. "You were doing what fathers do," I said, "trying to prepare your children for the world as you understand it. But the world changed, and what felt like protection became limitation. That's not your fault. It's just what happens when contexts shift faster than beliefs can adapt." "So this consulting business," my father said, finally looking up at me, "you think you can make it work?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "There's risk involved, and it might fail. But I've spent 18 months proving to myself that I'm capable of more than I believed I was. I've helped other people and organizations discover the same thing. And I think the skills I've developed are valuable enough that people will pay for them. More importantly, I'd rather try and fail than spend another decade wondering what might have been possible if I'd been brave enough to try." My father nodded slowly. "Your grandfather, my dad, he had a chance once to start a small carpentry business. He was skilled with his hands, could have made beautiful furniture, but his father convinced him it was too risky, that he should stick with factory work because it was more secure. He regretted it his whole life, I think. Used to talk about the furniture he could have made when he'd had a few pints." This was new information. I'd never heard this story about my grandfather. "Did that regret influence how you approached your own career?" "Probably. my father admitted. I told myself I was being practical and responsible, but maybe I was also being afraid. Afraid of ending up like him, full of regret about roads not taken. So I stayed the course, never deviated, never risked anything. And I provided for my family, which matters. But I also never discovered what I might have been capable of if I'd been willing to take some risks. We sat with that acknowledgement for a moment, 3 generations of limiting beliefs laid out between us like a map of inherited fears and protective strategies that had outlived their usefulness. I don't want to regret the roads I didn't take, I said quietly. I don't want to be 73 and wondering what might have been possible if I'd been braver. And I don't want any children I might have to inherit that pattern of playing it safe and calling it wisdom. Then don't, my father said simply. Break the chain. Do what your grandfather didn't do and what I didn't do. Find out what you're actually capable of instead of letting fear decide what you're allowed to try. That conversation with my father cleared something I hadn't fully realized was blocking me. I'd been carrying not just my own limiting beliefs but generational beliefs, inherited fears that had been passed down like family heirlooms without anyone questioning whether they still served a useful purpose. Breaking those chains wasn't just about my own liberation. It was about ending a cycle that had constrained my family's potential for generations. I returned to Manchester that evening and called Thomas. I'm in, I said without preamble. Let's build this thing properly. Let's create something that helps people and organizations break free from whatever's keeping them stuck. And let's prove that entrepreneurship isn't just for people with MBAs and trust funds. Let's prove that people from working-class backgrounds can build successful businesses if they're willing to challenge the beliefs that say they can't. Thomas's excitement was audible through the phone. Brilliant. I've already been sketching out business plans and potential client targets. When can we meet to start working through the details? Over the next 3 months, Thomas and I worked intensively on building what we eventually named Breakthrough Organizational Solutions. The name was Thomas's idea, deliberately choosing a term that captured both what we did, helping organizations break through limitations, and what the outcome was, breakthrough results that seemed impossible before beliefs changed. We developed a clear methodology based on my warehouse experience and the psychological frameworks Dr. Mitchell had taught me. We created case studies documenting the transformations I'd led. We built a website and marketing materials that explained our approach without using so much psychological jargon that business leaders would be put off. And we prepared to do something that scared both of us. Leave secure positions to start a business with no guaranteed clients, no steady income, and no certainty that anyone would actually pay for what we were offering. It was exactly the kind of risk that my old limiting beliefs would have immediately vetoed as irresponsible and foolish. But I'd learned to distinguish between wise caution based on evidence and limiting fear based on outdated beliefs. This risk was calculated, strategic, and aligned with both my capabilities and my values. That didn't guarantee success, but it meant the attempt was worth making regardless of the outcome. The first real test of our business came from an unexpected source. Caroline, true to her word about wanting to maintain a relationship with my expertise, contracted with Breakthrough Organizational Solutions to help with an expansion project her company was undertaking in mainland Europe. They were opening new facilities in Rotterdam and Hamburg and wanted to build strong organizational cultures from the beginning rather than having to fix cultural problems later. It was a significant contract, enough to sustain both Thomas and me for several months while we built up additional clients. But the European project introduced challenges I hadn't faced in the UK context. Cultural differences meant that the same limiting beliefs manifested differently and required different approaches to challenge. The learned helplessness I'd encountered in Glasgow didn't exist in Rotterdam, but there was a different kind of limiting belief system built around rigid adherence to established procedures and reluctance to deviate from proven methods even when circumstances had changed. The defensive resistance I dealt with in Liverpool wasn't present in Hamburg, but there was a cultural emphasis on hierarchy and formal credentials that made some people resistant to learning from someone they perceived as junior or unconventional. Working through these cultural variations taught me that while the fundamental principles of belief change were universal, the specific tactics needed to be adapted to local contexts. What worked in Northern England didn't necessarily work in the Netherlands or Germany, not because the psychology was different, but because the cultural expressions of limiting beliefs were different. This realization deepened my understanding of the work and made the methodology more robust and flexible. During this period, My relationship with Rachel also deepened in ways that forced me to confront another layer of limiting beliefs I hadn't fully addressed. We'd been together for over a year, and things were serious enough that conversations about moving in together and long-term commitment were becoming unavoidable. Rachel had been offered a position at a university in Edinburgh that would be a significant career advancement for her, but taking it would mean ending our relationship or requiring one of us to relocate. The decision forced both of us to evaluate whether this relationship was something we wanted to commit to long-term, or whether we'd been enjoying something comfortable without considering its future. The old me would have found ways to avoid this conversation, to keep things ambiguous and non-committed, because commitment felt terrifying and vulnerable. But I'd learned that avoiding difficult conversations was itself a limiting belief in action, a protective strategy that prevented pain in the short term but created bigger problems in the long term. So I initiated the conversation we both knew we needed to have. "Rachel," I said one evening as we were walking through Heaton Park, "we need to talk about Edinburgh, about us, about what we're actually building here, and whether we're both committed to building something long-term or whether we're just seeing where things go without really deciding anything." Rachel stopped walking and turned to face me. "I've been waiting for you to bring this up," she said. I didn't want to be the one to push for a conversation about commitment because I know that's an area where you still have limiting beliefs to work through. But yes, we absolutely need to talk about this. We found a bench overlooking the boating lake and had the most honest, vulnerable conversation I'd ever had in a romantic relationship. I told her about my fears of commitment, about the belief that I would eventually disappoint her or fail to be enough, about the voice that whispered that people like me didn't end up in successful long-term relationships with accomplished women like her. She told me about her own limiting beliefs, about the fear that successful professional women had to choose between career and relationship, about the concern that moving for a partner would mean sacrificing her own ambitions and eventually resenting him for it. "So what do we do?" I asked. "How do we make this decision without letting limiting beliefs make it for us?" Rachel thought for a moment. "We do what you've been teaching organizations to do. We look at the evidence. What does the evidence actually show about our relationship? Are we compatible? Do we bring out the best in each other? Do we have shared values and complementary strengths? Do we want the same things from life, or at least compatible things? And then we make a decision based on that evidence, rather than on fear or limiting beliefs about what's possible for people like us." Looking at the evidence was illuminating. We were highly compatible intellectually and emotionally. We challenged each other to grow while also providing support and acceptance. We had shared values about personal development, contributing to others, and living authentic lives. We both wanted children eventually, and had similar ideas about parenting and family life. The evidence strongly suggested that this relationship was worth committing to and worth making sacrifices for. "I'll come to Edinburgh," I said. "Thomas and I are building a consulting business that can operate from anywhere. Most of our work will involve traveling to client sites anyway. Edinburgh is actually better positioned for the European work we're doing than Manchester is. And honestly, watching you turn down this opportunity because you're worried about our relationship would be watching you make a decision based on limiting beliefs. I can't help people challenge their limiting beliefs professionally if I'm enabling someone I love to make limiting belief-based decisions personally." Rachel looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're serious? You'd relocate for my career?" "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, genuinely curious about what assumption I was challenging. "You have a specific opportunity that requires a specific location. I have a flexible business that can operate from multiple locations. This isn't sacrifice, it's basic strategy. We go where the opportunities are, and we build our life around both of our professional development, not just one person's." "James," Rachel said softly, "most men I've dated have expected me to be the one who accommodates, who compromises, who sacrifices career for relationship. The fact that you're approaching this as an equal partnership where we both consider each other's opportunities it's exactly what I want, but didn't fully believe I could have. So we both had limiting beliefs about relationships and gender roles and professional ambitions that needed challenging." Rachel had been operating under the belief that successful professional women had to choose between career and relationship. I'd been operating under the belief that I wasn't the kind of man that accomplished women wanted to build lives with. Both beliefs were limiting our possibilities, and neither was based on current evidence. We decided together to challenge them by committing to build a life in Edinburgh that honored both of our professional ambitions and personal goals. 3 months later, I was standing in our new flat in Edinburgh's Marchmont neighborhood, unpacking boxes and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 2 years earlier, I'd been sitting in my car in Manchester, feeling trapped by invisible limitations, convinced that I wasn't capable of more than the comfortable but unsatisfying life I'd built. Now I was living in a new city with someone I loved, running a consulting business with my best friend, helping organizations across Europe overcome limiting beliefs, and feeling genuinely excited about the future in ways I'd never felt before. But perhaps the most meaningful marker of change came from an unexpected invitation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, my therapist who'd guided me through those crucial early months of transformation, contacted me about speaking at a professional conference for cognitive behavioral therapists. She wanted me to present on applying CBT frameworks to organizational transformation, to share the case studies and methodology I'd developed, to help other therapists understand how the individual-focused techniques they used in therapy rooms could be scaled to address collective limiting beliefs in organizations and communities. You've become a practitioner, researcher, Dr. Mitchell told me when we met for coffee to discuss the presentation. You've taken theoretical frameworks and applied them in novel contexts, documented what works and what doesn't, and developed insights that contribute to professional knowledge. The therapeutic community needs to hear from people like you who are doing applied research outside traditional academic settings. The invitation triggered a familiar surge of imposter syndrome. Who was I to present at a professional conference to people with PhDs and decades of clinical experience? I was just a logistics manager who'd gotten lucky with a few warehouse turnarounds and had somehow built a business around it. But I caught that thought immediately, recognized it as a limiting belief, trying to protect me from the vulnerability of being evaluated by experts, and challenged it with evidence. The evidence showed that I had developed genuine expertise in applying CBT principles to organizational contexts. I had documented case studies with measurable outcomes. I had insights from practical implementation that theoretical researchers might not have access to. I had a practitioner's perspective that could complement academic perspectives. The fact that my path to this expertise was unconventional didn't make the expertise less valid or valuable. It just made it different, with different strengths and different limitations. I accepted the invitation and spent weeks preparing the presentation, working with Thomas to create case studies that protected client confidentiality while illustrating the methodology clearly. Rachel helped me refine the theoretical framework and connect my practical insights to the academic research on belief change and organizational psychology. And when the conference day arrived, I stood in front of a room full of therapists, psychologists, and organizational development professionals and shared what I'd learned about breaking free from limiting beliefs at both individual and collective levels. The response was overwhelming. People approached me afterward with questions, with requests for copies of my methodology documentation, with invitations to collaborate on research projects, with interest in bringing breakthrough organizational solutions into their own client organizations. Several therapists mentioned that they'd been struggling with how to help clients apply insights from therapy to their professional lives and organizational contexts, and my presentation had given them concrete frameworks for making those connections. But the comment that meant the most came from Dr. Mitchell herself, who found me after the presentation had ended and the crowd had dispersed. "James," she said, "watching you present today, seeing the confidence and expertise you've developed, remembering where you started 2 years ago. This is why I do this work. This is what successful therapy looks like. Not someone who needs me indefinitely, but someone who's taken the tools I helped them discover and used them to build a life beyond what they initially thought was possible. You're not my client anymore. You're a colleague, and I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished." I felt tears prick my eyes unexpectedly. "I couldn't have done any of this without the foundation you helped me build," I said. "You gave me the framework for understanding that beliefs can change, that limitations are often self-imposed, that evidence can challenge assumptions. Everything that's happened since then has been applying that framework consistently and seeing where it leads." "That's exactly right," Dr. Mitchell said. "And now you're teaching others to do the same thing. You're passing on what you've learned, helping more people break free from their limiting beliefs. The ripple effects of the work you're doing will extend far beyond the people and organizations you work with directly. You're contributing to a cultural shift in how people think about potential and possibility. That's profound work, James. Don't underestimate its significance." Standing in that conference center in Edinburgh, surrounded by professionals who respected the work I was doing, about to return home to Rachel, and to continue building a business with Thomas that was exceeding our initial projections, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I'd stopped waiting for permission to occupy space, to contribute expertise, to pursue opportunities. I'd stopped expecting someone to eventually reveal that I'd been right all along about my limitations, that my success had been a fluke, that I wasn't actually qualified for the life I was building. The limiting beliefs hadn't disappeared entirely. They still arose occasionally, particularly when I faced new challenges or stepped into unfamiliar territory. But they'd lost their power to control my decisions or to define my sense of what was possible. They'd become background noise that I could recognize, evaluate, and choose to ignore when the evidence suggested they weren't serving me. That shift, from being controlled by limiting beliefs to being able to observe and manage them, was the difference between a life constrained by inherited fears and a life expanded by accumulated evidence of capability. 2 months after the conference, Thomas and I were invited to present our methodology to a consortium of European businesses interested in organizational transformation. The contract would be the largest we'd secured, requiring us to hire additional consultants and build out the methodology into a more structured training program. It was exactly the kind of scaling challenge that would test whether our approach could grow beyond the two of us delivering it personally. The night before the presentation, I lay awake in bed next to Rachel, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. From the paralyzed middle manager sitting in his car on a rainy Tuesday morning to the entrepreneur about to pitch to major European corporations, the transformation seemed almost impossible to reconcile. But it wasn't magic or luck or a personality transplant. It was systematic belief change, accumulated evidence, challenging limiting assumptions, and consistent application of simple but powerful principles. Every person carries limiting beliefs, inherited from family, culture, past experiences, and the stories they've told themselves about who they are and what they're capable of. These beliefs operate invisibly, restricting possibilities without us even recognizing the restrictions. They feel like truth rather than belief, like reality rather than interpretation, like fixed limitations rather than changeable assumptions. And because they feel like truth, we don't think to question them. We just live within their constraints, adapting our ambitions and dreams to fit within the boundaries they've established. But limiting beliefs are not truth. They're hypotheses about ourselves and the world that have never been properly tested. And when you develop the courage to test them, when you start gathering evidence through action rather than just accepting assumptions through inaction, you often discover that the beliefs were wrong, that you were capable of more than you believed, that opportunities were available that you'd assumed were closed, that the ceiling you'd been living under was an illusion that disappeared the moment you challenged it. Breaking free from limiting beliefs isn't a one-time achievement. It's a continuous practice, a way of approaching life that questions assumptions, tests hypotheses, and updates beliefs based on evidence rather than clinging to comfortable narratives. It requires intellectual humility to acknowledge when you're wrong, emotional courage to try things that feel uncomfortable, and patience to accumulate evidence gradually rather than expecting immediate transformation. But the payoff is extraordinary. It's not just about professional success or personal achievement, though those often follow. It's about living a life that's authentic to your actual capabilities, rather than constrained by inherited fears. It's about passing on empowering beliefs to the next generation, rather than limiting beliefs. It's about contributing your full potential to the world, rather than a diminished version shaped by assumptions about what people like you are allowed to do or be. As I finally drifted off to sleep that night, my last conscious thought was a simple but profound recognition. The person I'd become wasn't fundamentally different from the person I'd been 2 years earlier. The capabilities had always been there, dormant and undeveloped. The potential had always existed, unrecognized and unused. What had changed wasn't me. What had changed was what I believed about me, and that change in belief had unlocked everything else. The next morning, standing in front of the European consortium with Thomas beside me, presenting our methodology with confidence born from evidence rather than blind optimism, I understood viscerally what I'd been teaching intellectually. Limiting beliefs are chains we forge ourselves, often with the best intentions of protection and safety. But we also have the power to break those chains, to test our assumptions, to gather evidence that contradicts limiting narratives, and to build lives that are expansive rather than constrained. And perhaps most importantly, we have the ability to help others do the same. Every time we challenge our own limiting beliefs and succeed, we provide evidence not just for ourselves, but for everyone. Watching that change is possible, that limitations are often illusions, that human potential is far greater than we typically allow ourselves to access. We become living proof that breaking free is possible, and in doing so, we make it easier for the next person to break free, and the next, and the next. The chains of limiting beliefs have been passed down through generations, through cultures, through families, through societies. But every chain can be broken by someone willing to test whether it's actually necessary, or just assumed to be so. Every limiting belief can be challenged by someone willing to gather evidence rather than accept assumptions. Every constrained life can be expanded by someone brave enough to try. That's the revolution I'd stumbled into on that rainy Tuesday morning. Not a revolution of external circumstances, but an internal revolution of belief and possibility. And having experienced that revolution personally, and helped dozens of others experience it in their own contexts, I knew with certainty that it was the most important work I could possibly do. Because when people break free from limiting beliefs, they don't just change their own lives, they change what's possible for everyone around them. They raise the ceiling not just for themselves, but for their families, their communities, their organizations, and eventually their entire culture. The future was uncertain, as futures always are. The business might succeed beyond our projections, or it might fail in ways we hadn't anticipated. My relationship with Rachel might grow into the life partnership we were building toward, or it might end for reasons we couldn't currently foresee. The methodology we'd developed might scale to help thousands of organizations, or it might have limitations we hadn't yet discovered. But none of that uncertainty paralyzed me anymore because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. Limiting beliefs are simply beliefs, and beliefs can change. Evidence can challenge assumptions, capabilities can be developed, potential can be accessed. The only real question is whether you're willing to test the limits you've accepted, to gather evidence about what's actually possible, and to build a life based on current data rather than past fears. Everything else flows from that willingness to question, to test, to challenge, and to grow. I was ready for whatever came next, not because I knew it would work out perfectly, but because I knew I could handle it either way. That confidence, born from accumulated evidence of resilience and capability, was the ultimate freedom. The freedom from limiting beliefs, and the freedom to discover what's actually possible when you stop telling yourself stories about what's not.